All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Today's daf is Yud Aleph. We are picking up on Yud Amud Beis. A lot to do today, Meretz Hashem. We begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev. Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating all the Shiur and Drashas in memory of their parents. Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamos will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We also thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Matt and Diane Marks, in honor of the birth of their granddaughter, Rina Bracha Dorfman. May she go from strength to strength. Our Daf Yomi sponsors, in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Ruchama Aviva, Bas Shenechana, as well as for Achal Yehudis, Bas Tova Gittel, and by Jacob and Julie Blumenfeld for Refuah Shalema for Joey Rosen, Yosef Michael, Ben Yehudis Shoshana. We thank all of our sponsors, and we hope all the Neshama should have an Aliyah, and Kol Cholei Yisrael should enjoy an enduring and eternal refuah. And Abosai, with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Thank you for accommodating a little bit of the earlier start. So we are picking up on Yud Amud Beis. We're actually picking up from the Imtim Salomar, but you know what? Let's just pick up from the beginning. Boi Rava, which is right across from Tosfos Mi Amrinan, which is kind of right there in the middle of the page. Do you see where I am? Right, if you see Tosfos Mi Amrinan on the right-hand side, go right into there in the Gemara. We actually read this, but let's just pick up with the case. Again, it'll take us a minute just to catch up where we left off. Boi Rava, Achbar Nichnas V'Kikar B'Fiv, V'Achbar Yotze V'Kikar B'Fiv. Ultimately, I'm sorry, actually, no, skip down a little bit. Achbar Lavan, that's where we actually left off. So it's about 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down from where I just told you. So Achbar Lavan Nichnas V'Kikar B'Fiv, Achbar Shachar Yotzer V'Kikar B'Fiv. Supposed to remember, we did this case yesterday. This is where we left off. You have a white mouse that goes in with a loaf in its mouth, and then a black mouse that comes out with a loaf in its mouth. So what's the halacha mahu? Hay vaday achrinahu. So we'll say on one hand, obviously the white mouse is different than the black mouse. O dilma armuye armemine. Or I will say, do we say that although the mice are different, the loaf is the same? And can we make the assumption that the loaf that went in is the same loaf that came out? And even if you want to say, well, mice don't normally take from each other, right? That's not the derech of mice to generally take from one another. The Gemara says, but say, what happens if you see a mouse run into the house with a loaf in its mouth, and you see a weasel run out with a loaf in its mouth? So what could we piece together? In other words, what are we assuming is happening in this scenario? So do we say, well, it must be that the weasel went ahead and took the loaf from the mouse? Or maybe we'll say it's just a different loaf. Maybe the loaf that the mouse went in with is somewhere in the house, and the loaf that the weasel is coming out with is a separate loaf. Because I will say the truth is, the Gemara says, because if it was true that the weasel was carrying the loaf that the mouse had in its mouth, then what? The mouse should have been in the weasel's mouth as well. That's the assumption. The mouse is not just going to give up its loaf. Then maybe the weasel must have taken a bite out of the mouse. So the weasel should have had both the mouse and the loaf in its mouth. The Gemara says, and if you accept that approach, that if the loaf that the weasel was holding was the same loaf that the mouse originally had, then the mouse would have been in the mouth of the weasel as well. Then what about the following case? If a mouse goes into the home with a loaf in its mouth, and now the chulda comes out, the weasel comes out of the house, and in the mouth of the weasel is what? Both the mouse and the loaf. Mahu. What's the halacha in that case? Do we say hakavada ihu? So we'll say. So do we say, well, look, if I see the mouse going in with the loaf, and I see then the achbar, right, coming out with the mouse and the loaf in its mouth, then it's clear that what? That the loaf that's coming out was the same loaf that went in. O dilma, or perhaps I would say, im isa deihu niu kikar befi achbar mishtachach havabai ishtachuche. Or do I say no? If it was really the same loaf, then I will say, what should it have been? It should be that the achbar is in the mouth of the weasel, and the loaf is still in the mouth of the mouse. But if it's the mouse and the loaf that are both in the mouth of the weasel, then maybe it's just a different loaf. The Gemara says, "O Dilma, mishum be'isusa hu nafal v'shakalter." Maybe we say again, the mouse was frightened, and that's why the mouse dropped the loaf, and therefore the chulda picks up the loaf and the mouse. So we'll say the answer to all of these is teku, right? Teku. So we'll say, so just, again, now the truth is the resolution of a lot of these cases, as we saw it in yesterday's daf, is lakula, because remember again, bedikas chometz is drabanan. Bedikas chometz is drabanan. Remember again, because as we saw in yesterday's daf, as we've seen before, midaraisa bebitul sagile, right? For midaraisa, bittul would be enough to obviate all chometz concerns. So ultimately, again, bedika is midrabanan. So again, as we've seen, a lot of these cases will be resolved lakula. So the Gemara goes right there. Bay Rava, kikar b'shmei karbo. So this is an interesting case. What happens if you have a kikar, a loaf of bread, on a very high beam? On a very high beam. So that's kikar b'shmei korah. Tzarach sulam lahorida in tzarach. So we'll say, listen to this. So I have a loaf of bread on a very high beam. So halacha lamaisa again. Do I have to take a ladder? Do I have to take a ladder to go ahead and retrieve it or not? So the Gemara says, you hear the shayla over here? So this is, don't ask why the kikar is on a high beam, but I will say, imagine, what do you call it? There's architecture like this, right? Where you have exposed beams. It's a form of architecture, right? Okay, good. Exposed beam architecture. Menachem, what is it called when you have exposed beams? What is that called? What type of architecture is that? Isn't there a name for it?
Exposed beams.
Exposed beams. Excellent. Good. Well, no, good. All right. Excellent. We'll go with exposed beams. Good. So I'll say. So you can imagine you have exposed beams. So you have a beam very high up. You have a loaf of bread on the beam. Now you know the loaf of bread is there. It's not a shaila. Is there a loaf of bread? You know there's a loaf of bread there. So now the shaila is: are you mechuyev to go ahead and get it down, or can you just do bittul? I will say. Remember again. Bittul takes care of all, because remember, let's take a step back. Why is it that even though bittul is enough, I do bedika? Like we've learned this before, right? And everybody got this right. All those who submitted the bechinas, and incredibly ashkach to those who have done so, everybody got this question right. Right? So ultimately, again, why do we go ahead and do, why do we do bedika if we already did bittul? Because you might find it. So we'll say in this case over here, is there a concern that I'm going to come in contact with a piece of chametz? Not really. It's on a very high beam. So listen to this. So we'll say, do we say that on one hand, the Chazal didn't require you to exert yourself to this degree to hunt down chametz. In other words, to go get a ladder and go up to the rooftop and go up to the beam to get down a loaf of bread, Chazal never required you to do that. The Gemara says, because ultimately, again, about saying, person doesn't really go up to the beam, so we're not concerned that they're going to come to eat the loaf. Odilma, zimnin denafa va'asila michle. Or about say, look, there is a possibility that's what, while it is true that you're not going up there to get the loaf, what could happen? Right? You could have a draft or a gust of wind that could blow the loaf down, and suddenly again the loaf is accessible to you, and therefore maybe you should have to go up and get it. So we'll say, so maybe you'll say, okay, if you do have a loaf of bread that's on a high beam, you do have to go and get it. Why? Because out of the concern that maybe a wind will blow it down. I'll say, by the way, that is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. That if you know that you have a loaf of bread, you have chametz on a very high beam, even though it's clearly inaccessible to you, and you never go up there, if you know that it's there, on some technical level it's accessible. Because we will talk about inaccessible chametz. And inaccessible chametz, you don't necessarily have to go ahead and search for. But lamaisa, if it's accessible, and if you know where it is, you have to go up to the rooftop or the rafter, the beam, to get it, because it may blow down. So what about the following case? Fine. We'll say first wide line, Yoramid base. Kikar babar. What about if the loaf, Rabbi say, is not on a high beam? But what happens if the loaf is in a pit? I have a bar, right? I have a pit in my backyard. So what happens? Rabbi say, and I have a piece, and I have a loaf of bread in there. I know there's a loaf. Rabbi say, this is not a suffix case, right? I know there's a loaf of bread in there. Am I mechuyev to go down and get the loaf of bread? Do I need to get a ladder, go down into the pit to retrieve the loaf or not? So we'll say ultimately again, I'm certainly not going to go down there myself. In other words, I never go down to that pit. So I'm not really concerned that I'm going to go ahead and come in contact ultimately again with that loaf. On the other hand, Odilma, Zimnin dinachis leme'avet surche va'asei lemichle. So we'll say, so on one hand, the loaf is never going to come to me. In other words, we'll say, remember again, in the case of the loaf on the upper beam, so there's always the possibility that what? A wind will come and blow it down. So though I don't have intention to go up to the beam, the loaf may come to me. Here, obviously, I will say, in a case where the loaf is in the pit, the loaf is not going to get, blown up. It's not. There's not going to be a gust of wind that lifts it from the pit onto my table. So there's no concern about the loaf coming to me. But is there a concern that maybe sometimes if a person has to relieve themselves and there's not another bathroom accessible, I may go down into the pit to take care of my bodily needs. And if the chametz is there, again, in a moment, in a lapse of awareness, I may come to consume the chametz. And I will say, so maybe sometimes you're right. So maybe I have to be concerned I'm going to go down to the pit to take care of my needs, and I may come to eat the chametz. Listen to this case. What happens if there is a loaf of bread in the mouth of a snake? Right? And the snake is in my property, right? So now, again, this is my loaf in the mouth of a snake in my property. We'll see, this is a great case. Tzarich chabar lahotzi, o ein tzarich. We'll say, do you need a chabar? We'll say, a chabar is a snake charmer. Do you need to hire a snake charmer in order to go ahead and get the loaf out of the mouth of the snake? So the Gemara says, do we say, bigufe achruchuhu rabbanan, bimamone lo achruchu rabbanan? So we'll say, do we say, well, look, when it comes to b'dikas chametz, Chazal only required me to go ahead and exert myself. But Chazal did not require me to start spending money for b'dikas chametz. So I'm not required to go ahead and hire a snake charmer. Perhaps no. Perhaps you do have to spend your money to go ahead and hire a snake charmer, to which the Gemara says, teku. So interestingly enough, in the case of the pit, one would not be mechuyev to go ahead and get the chametz. Again, and we'll discuss those cases because there are cases that we'll discuss about chametz being buried under rubble, inaccessible chametz. In the pit, it's considered inaccessible. You don't have to go and get it. On the beam in your ceiling, exposed beam in the ceiling, you would have to get it because there's the concern that halacha l'maisa, the wind could blow it off and you may have immediate access to it. So we'll say this discussion of accessibility to chametz is going to be incredibly important, which is why in general, that let's say when cleaning your home for Pesach, one never needs to be concerned with the Cheerio underneath the refrigerator, right? Because I will say, again, anything underneath the refrigerator is always the classic case of inaccessibility, unless you move your refrigerator often. But Bepashtos, again, if people like to clean, that's absolutely fine. But in general, the din of b'dikas chametz is with accessible chametz. If it's inaccessible, then we'll say, but I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, one second, the Gemara just floated the idea that maybe when it comes to b'dikas chametz, the only time Chazal required you to exert yourself ultimately is with your body. But Chazal did not require you to spend money. Now we'll say, why doesn't that sit well with you? I'm sorry? So what was it? But we just learned this. Oh, we had a Gemara that what? Oh, where? Remember what was the case? Oh, so we'll see. Remember, excellent. Remember the case where we spoke about this idea where you rented a home. This was the Mekach To's case. I rent a home from Reuven. Excellent. We'll say I rent a home from Reuven, and halacha l'maisa again, he promised me that he was renting me a home that was baduk. It turns out that it wasn't baduk. It wasn't checked. So the Gemara says, afilu ba'asra, even in a place where normally you would hire someone to do your bedika, it's still not a Mekach To's. Why? Most remember the lashon of the Gemara? Neicha le'inish. Le'avid mitzvah b'mamone. Excellent. We'll say good. Baruch Hashem. So this Chazar is good. Ultimately, again, because people like spending their money on mitzvahs. So why does the Gemara over here say that Chazal never required you to spend money on b'dikas chametz? So we'll say, look at Tosas very quickly. Tosas says b'mamone lo achichu rabbanon perish hacha dafka. We'll say it's daf. Remember again, so Tosas says no. In general. Chazal would require you to spend money on b'dikas chametz, and people want to spend money on b'dikas chametz. This case, I will say, if the snake is a different kind of case. Why is it a different kind of case? Look at Rashi. It's still Tosa, sorry. Perish hacha dafka, deshema yotziena, o yochlena. See, I both say, in the snake case, the snake may end up taking the chametz just out of my property, or the snake may eat it. Aval hecha diika chametz amrinan la'el denecha le'inish de'avid mitzvah b'mamoni. We'll say this is very interesting. That when are people good with spending money on mitzvahs? When I know that there's a definitive need. The snake case, I will say, is I'm not sure what's going to happen. There's so many possibilities. Possibility one is the snake may just drop the loaf in my property. Possibility two is that the snake may eat it. Possibility two is that the snake may take it out. So it could be that in that kind of case, where there's not a clear obligation as to what my relationship with this chametz is, that's where Chazal would not require me to spend my money. But where there is a definitive need for bedikas chametz, under those circumstances, absolutely one would need to go ahead and spend money on the mitzvah. We'll say beautiful. Says the Mishnah. We'll say Rabbi Huda Omer, both kin or Yudalad ubi Yudalad Chachris ubi Shas Habir. So Rabbi Huda says, now we'll say what it sounds like is that Rabbi Huda is saying that we check for chametz 3 different times, 3 different bedigos. We go ahead and we check the night of the 14th, the morning of the 14th, ubi Shas Habir, and at the time that you burn chametz. Time that you burn chametz. Ficham the chum say, lo badak or yudalid yivdok b'yudalid. Lo badak b'yudalid yivdok b'soch hamoed. So we'll say, the chacham say like this, you only have to do one bedika. And ideally, when is that bedika done? The night of the 14th. If for some reason you didn't check for chametz the night of the 14th, you could check the morning of the 14th, or during the day of the 14th. If you did not check during the morning of the 14th, you could check b'soch hamoed. I will say, b'soch hamoed, you automatically, I would assume this means what? Right? So chalamai, yamtiv. Look at Rashi says, b'soch hamoed means b'shash shishis, from the 6th hour and on. So we'll say b'soch hamoed really means once chametz becomes usher. Remember, we're going to see this. Midrabanan chametz becomes usher at the beginning of the 6th hour. Midraisa is really the end of the 6th hour, beginning of the 7th hour. So Rashi says over here, b'soch hamoed means b'shash shishis. So we'll say, according to the Rabbanon, you should check at night. If you didn't check at night, the very Pesach, you check in the morning. If you didn't check in the morning, you check up to the 6th hour. If you didn't check up to the 6th hour, you even check after the 6th hour. Now watch this. Lo badak b'soch hamoed. What happens if halacha l'maisa again, you did not check? I'm sorry, I should actually be more specific. According to b'soch hamoed means in the 6th hour itself. Let me clarify. In the 6th hour. If you did not check in the 6th hour, lo badak b'soch hamoed, yivdok la'achar hamoed. Then you check after the 6th hour and on. Rashi says, mishesh sha'us l'mayla ad shetechshach. You check from after the 6th hour up until the start of Yom Tiv. The Gemara says, "Umash mishayer," whatever chametz you're leaving over. And I will say this is talking about. So I will say so. Machlokes as to how bedikas chametz happens. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're checking the morning of the 14th. Excuse me, the night of the 14th, the morning of the 14th, and ultimately again at the time you destroy the chametz. According to the Chachamim, you should check the night of the 14th. If you forgot to check the night, you could check the morning. If you didn't check the morning, you could check in the 6th hour. If you didn't check in the 6th hour, you should check ultimately again after the 6th hour, up until the start of Pesach. Whatever chametz you leave over, Masha Mishayer, Yani Chena B'tzina. So Rabbi said this goes back to what we learned before. Whatever chametz you're leaving over after your bedika, because also remember again, it's very common. You do bedikas chametz in your home, but you still have some chametz. I do the bedika on the night of the 14th, but I still want to have breakfast. I'm going to have chametz for breakfast. So whatever chametz I leave over, I should make sure to leave over in a secure location. Kedei shelo yehei tzarich bedika acharov. In order that halacha l'maisa, you don't require a second bedika afterwards. Because remember, if you are not careful with how you store your leftover chametz, that's when you get into all of your weasel and mice situations, as we have seen. Says the Gemara, my time with Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, what's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Why did Rabbi Yehuda require so many bedikos? Says the Gemara, Rav Chistav Rav Baravuna Dami Tarvayu Kineged Shalosh Hashbasas Shebatorah. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Yehuda's shita is as follows. The Torah discusses the destruction of chametz 3 times. So from that, Rabbi Yehuda learns that there are 3 different bedikos that one is obligated to perform. A bedika the night of Erev Pesach, a bedika the morning of Erev Pesach, and a bedika ultimately again when you destroy the chametz. What are the 3 mentions? Lo yirai lecha chametz, v'lo yirai lecha sar. That's 1. Shivas yom sar le'maseh v'aseichem. That's 2. Ach b'amarishon tashbisus su'ar mi batechem. So we'll say, so Allah l'maisa, because the Torah mentions the destruction of chametz 3 times, therefore Rabbi Yehuda requires 3 bedikos. Masiv Rav Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol shelo badak b'shlosha prakim halalu Shuv Eina Bodeg. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so Rav Yosef brings up that another brayso, Rabbi Huda says, anyone who did not check during these 3 times does not check anymore. So we'll say, so again, you have 3 times to check, or 3 times obligated to check. Night of the 14th, morning of the 14th, time you destroy the chametz. And if you missed those 3 times, there is no longer an obligation for any type of bedika. What do you see from here? Alba b'mikan ve'elechu depligi. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara wants to suggest, or Rav Yosef wants to suggest, that the real machlokes Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanon ultimately, again, is going to be in a situation of what happens if you did not check by the 6th hour. What occurs then? So Rabbi Huda apparently says that halacha l'maaseh, if you missed from the 6th hour, if you missed that last bedika, there is no longer an obligation of bedikas chametz. So we'll say, look at Rashi just a moment. Mikan ve'elechu depligi v'lo b'midi achrina. Rabbi Huda lo matzich shalosh bedikos elahachi kamar o or le'arba'asar o shachris o b'shah shishis. So we'll say Rav Yosef is framing the machlokes a little differently. See, Pasha Pshat, the way you read the Mishnah, is the machlokes Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanon is what Rabbi say. The machlokes is the Rabbanon say, how many bedikos do you perform? How many bedikos? 1, right? The Rabbanon 1, right? And again, 3 different time frames, but 1 bedika, right? Either at night, the morning, or ultimately again in the 6th hour, or again after, right? Or excuse me, I take that back. Let's take that back. According to the Rabbani, you go ahead and you conduct 1 bedika. You just have multiple times in which you could go ahead and perform that bedika. Rabbi Huda, 3 bedikos. Comes along Rabbi Huda says, no, that's not their machlokes. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maaseh you only go ahead and perform 1 bedika. So what's the machlokes? The machlokes is when. So according to the Rabbanon, you have the night of the 14th, the morning of the 14th, in the 6th hour, and even after the 6th hour, up until nightfall. 4 different time frames in order to go ahead and perform the bedika. According to Rabbi Huda, you only have 3. You have the morning, you have the night, the morning, and shas haber when you're destroying the chametz. But if you didn't do it by the time you destroy the chametz, no more bedika. That's the machlokes. So Mar Zutra masni hachi. So Mar Zutra had a different version. Masiv Rav Yosef, Rabbi Huda Omer kol shelo badak b'acham mishlosha prakim halalu. Shuv eina bodek. Rabbi Huda said, if you did not utilize one of these 3 time frames, there is no longer an obligation to do bedika. Alma b'shuv eina bodek hu depligi. Therefore, Rabbi say the machlokes in Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanon is not in how many bedikos you have to do, but rather what? Their machlokes is what is the time, or what is the last time for bedikas chametz? According to Rabbi Huda, ultimately again it's the time that you burn the chametz. According to the Rabbanon, you could do it all the way up to Yom Tiv, to which the Gemara says, El Rabbi Huda, Nami imla bada kamar. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda is also referring to a situation where a person didn't do the bedika. That's what they're arguing about. Mar savar mikamei surah in, basri surah lo. So both say, what is Rabbi Huda concerned? I'm going to read it. Rabbanan Savi Lo Gezerah. Both say, listen to this. Here's the concern. Rabbi Huda says you can only do the bedika up until the Zman Isser, up until the time that Chametz becomes Asr. But once Chametz becomes Asr, you can't do the bedika anymore. The Rabbanan say, yes, you can. Even once Chametz becomes Asr, you can go ahead and do the bedika. Both say, what is the logic? What are they arguing about? So this is incredible. Rabbi Huda does not want you handling Chametz after the Zman Isser. Why? Why not? What is he concerned about? You may come to eat it. Why would we want the person handling Chametz after the Zman Isser Chametz begins? A person may come to inadvertently consume it. And the Rabbanan are saying, no, we're not concerned about that. Remember, again, the Rabbanan are going to say, remember, why are you looking for it? You're looking for it because it's Asr. So to say that you're going to come to eat it when the very reason you're looking for it is because it's Asr, it doesn't make any sense. So both say, therefore, we're reframing the machlokes. The machlokes is no longer about how many times you have to do bedika, but rather the machlokes is when can you do bedika until. According to the Rabbanan, you could do bedika all the way up until the start of Pesach. According to Rabbi Huda, up until the Zman Isser Chametz. Because we don't want you handling Chametz after this man Isser, out of a fear that you may come to eat it. So we'll say, so is this a general rule of Rabbi Huda that we don't want you handling things that you are not allowed to eat? out of a concern that you may come to eat it, which I will say is a legitimate thing to say, but is this Rabbi Yehuda Shita? Well, after all, listen to this. This is fascinating. Vatnan, Mishakarav ha'omer yotzinu motzinu b'shukei Yerushalayim, shem aleim kemach v'kali. So I will say, what do you see? So listen to this. Karban Omer, second day Pesach, you offer up a barley offering. That barley offering permits chadash. Chadash is the new crop that was planted since last Pesach. So something amazing happened, I will say, which was what? That on the second day of Pesach, when you would go out into now remember, second day Pesach in Eretz Yisrael is Chol Hamoed. So remember again, you would go out into the marketplace of Yerushalayim, and what would you find? You would find an abundance, ultimately again, of flour and roasted grain. Now I will say, now that was all chadash. That was just permitted by the Karban Omer. Now, both say, by the time you went out in the morning of second day Pesach, that was already in the stalls, right? That was already in Machane Yehuda. So we'll say, so what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that the merchants prepared that wheat, that grain already, even before the Karban HaOmer was offered. So this is very interesting. They weren't eating it, but you see they were preparing the wheat before the Karban HaOmer, even though consumption is prohibited ultimately again until after Karban HaOmer. So this is the Kashan Rabbi Huda, because Rabbi Huda says in general, we don't want you handling food items that you're not allowed to eat, lest you come to eat it. But here they were clearly handling the Chadash grain even before the offering of the Omer. Top of Yud Aleph. Oh good, today's daf. Listen to this. Shelo b'ritzon chacham heinos in Divrei Meir. So we'll say ultimately, Rabbi Meir said, they did this against the will of the Chachamim. The Chachamim were not happy with this practice. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'ratzon chacham hayu osim. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the Chachamim were totally okay with this. So we'll say in Rabbi Meir's view, they did it, but we'll say sometimes people do things that Chazal don't like. But nevertheless, we'll say, is it aser? Okay, so the Rabbanan didn't like it. Yet Rabbi Yehuda said, it's not a problem. Chazal were totally okay with it. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Why isn't Rabbi Yehuda concerned that you may come? I'll say, why is Rabbi Yehuda concerned that you may come to eat the chadash before the offering of the Omer? Again, remember again, Rabbi Yehuda is the one over here who says, we don't want you doing bedikas chametz after hour number 6, out of a concern that if you find the chametz, you're going to eat it. We don't want you handling items that are prohibited for consumption. Yet here, by chadash, he seemingly has no problem with the merchants handling the chadash grain before the bringing of the Omer. So listen to this. The Gemara says, Amarava shiny chadash mitoch shelo hitartelo ela al yedei kituf hu zachar. So we'll say this is very interesting. How do you go ahead? So we'll say this is very interesting. When they would go ahead and harvest the chadash grain before the offering of the Omer, so halacha l'maisa, you were not permitted to harvest that grain in a normal harvesting way with a sickle. You had to harvest it by hand. So because you had to harvest it by hand, therefore what? Therefore there's a hecker, there's a reminder. People realize once you're harvesting by hand, I'm not allowed to eat this, I'm not allowed to deal with this. And they would prepare it. But there was because there was a shinui essentially, because they had to harvest it in a different way, there was no concern of consumption. Look at Rashi in just a moment. Rabbi Yehuda Omer mitoch shelo hitartelo ketzira kederach kol hashana ela biyadayim kotfin hamalilos min hakarka do asr liktra lefnei Omer dechsev Omer Reishis Ketzirchem. So we'll say, interesting if the Torah refers to the Omer offering, the Karban Omer, as the first harvest. So therefore, halacha l'maaseh, you cannot harvest standing grain with a sickle in a normal way before the Karban Omer. So if you wanted to pick chadash grain, to have it ready, to process it and to have it ready for immediate consumption after the bringing of the Omer, that's time, but you would have to pick it, or you would have to harvest it by hand. So Rabbi Yehuda says, since you're harvesting it by hand, that is such a dramatic shinui, people aren't going to come to consume it. So the Gemara says, that's fine that you're harvesting it by hand. But I will say, but what about the fact, but we'll say, remember again, there's a whole processing, right? What about the grinding of it, the sifting of it? In other words, we'll say, at a certain point in time, that's a fine shinui for the person who's harvesting it. But Pepashas, other people are involved in the production. They're producing the grain in a normal fashion. Why aren't you concerned that Allah is going to come to consume it? To which the Gemara says, "Hello, kasha tchina berechia dayad harkada agabe nafa inachinami." You would also grind and sift this wheat with a shinui. You would only grind it with a hand mill, as opposed to a large stone mill, and you would also go ahead and sift it with the back of the sifter. In other words, if you wanted to prepare chadash grain so that it should be ready for consumption immediately after the offering of the Karban Omer, you could do that. but every step of the process had to be done in a regular shinui fashion. And that would take care of the concern that a person would come to inadvertently consume it. Elahadisnan. So therefore I will say it's very possible that, so therefore Rabbi Huda's shita by chametz is not contradicted by his shita by chadash. By chadash he's not concerned about having you handle an item that is prohibited for consumption. Since the handling of it is done in such a shinui dika way, we're not concerned you're going to come to consume it. Masha'im king by chametz, we don't want you searching for chametz after the zman iser, because we're really concerned you may come to eat it. Elahadisnan, kolchin beis hashalchin, v'shebe amamakim. So let's listen to this. So the halacha is as follows. You're permitted to go ahead and kolchin, literally you could harvest beis hashalchin, both says an irrigated field. V'shebe amamakim, or the field in the valleys or the plains. Avalo goatshin. But halacha l'maisa, but you can't go ahead and pile things. So both say, so this again is talking about the Karban Omer. V'okimnak Rabbi Yehuda, and we established this like Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, okay, Rabbi Yehuda, Ma'ikal Meimar, Ela Amra Abaye Chadish Bad. So both say, so again, here there are examples over here. Again, Rashi goes into this. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, V'shal beis ha'amakim, tevuah ha'gedela bein ha'amakim. For time of first week, I'm supposed to say, interestingly enough, this was inferior grain. So the halacha is that you are permitted to go ahead and harvest these fields of inferior grain even before the offering of the Karban Omer. So Rashi explains, because it's only the type of grain that would have been fit for Karban Omer, for which there is a prohibition to harvest it before the Karban Omer. But if you have grain that is of inferior quality and therefore could not be offered up for Karban Omer, there is no problem with going ahead and harvesting it before the Karban Omer. Even though there's no problem with harvesting it, you still what? You still can't eat it before the offering of the Karban HaOmer. So yet again, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't seem to have a problem with this practice. So you can harvest it in a normal way. Why aren't we concerned that halacha l'maisa you may come to eat something which is prohibited? Rabbi Chadish Badul Minei Chametz Lo Badul Minei. So both say, Rabbi advances a very interesting distinction, which is, in general, people are careful with Chadash. Right? People know about the halachas of Chadash. And remember again, Chadash, Rabbi say, is prohibited for a significant amount of time. People know to stay away from Chadash. See, Rabbi say, Chametz is only usher 8 days out of the year. So because of that, the learned behavior when it comes to Chametz is eat it, right? Eat it. That's the learned behavior. Takes a lot of time to unlearn learned behavior. So therefore, yeah, Rabbi Yehuda is very concerned that on Erev Pesach, after the Zman Isser, if you're searching for chametz and you find something, that learned behavior kicks in. You find the Danish, I will say, a Jew finds a Danish, there's a Pavlovian response, right? You find the Danish, you eat it, right? That's the way it works. And that's my learned behavior, right? The majority of the year, 51 weeks out of the year, that's my learned behavior. So now again, chametz just became usher a few hours ago, and now again I'm going to find the Danish. The statistical probability is I'm going to eat it. This is different. Don't handle it. Chadash, people know to stay away from. The isser of chadash is a much more prolonged isser. Therefore, there's no concern, even if you harvest it in the normal way, that a person is going to come to consume it. Amar Rava, Rabbi Yehuda kasha. Rabbanan lo kasha. So ultimately, Rava says, but still, the shitas of Rabbi Yehuda contradict each other. The shitas of the Rabbanan don't contradict each other. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha kiddushin. So we'll say no. As we just said before, Rabbi Yehuda by chadash and Rabbi Yehuda by chametz are not contradicting each other. Why don't Rabbi Yehuda by chadash and Rabbi Yehuda by chametz contradict each other? Because as we just said, by chadash, we're confident people know about the isser, it's a prolonged isser, and people stay away from the isser. Chametz is such a short window of prohibition. The learned behavior we're concerned that the learned behavior will overcome the new behavior, and therefore a person may come to consume it. And the Rabbanan don't pose a contradiction either. Why? Who atzmo mechazra love the sarfo mechal ka'achal minei. So we'll say the Rabbanan say in general that we don't have a concern that a person is going to come to consume the chametz. Why not, I will say? Because the whole reason you're looking for it is why? To destroy it. So I'll say, so if you're looking to destroy it because you know that it's usher, it's counterintuitive to think that when you finally find the item that you are looking for, in order to destroy it because it's usher, you're going to have a momentary lapse of awareness and come to eat it. I'll say it happens to be an interesting machlokes just in general, like in terms of how people operate. So the Rabbanan say, essentially we'll say, think about this, the Rabbanan saying, once you have a singular mission, you have a singular focus in life, we trust that you are not going to veer from that. Right? Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says, Maisim b'chol yom, that people get on a singular track, a singular focus, and they lose that vision very quickly. All it takes, right? All it takes is a momentary lapse, is a snap of the fingers to derail a person from the mission at hand. So it's really a fascinating idea. Okay, that's the machlokes. Says Rav Ashi Amar, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda Kasha, Kemach v'kali tinan. So we'll say ultimately again, and Rav Ashi says that the truth is Rabbi Yehuda is not contradicting himself as well. Why not? Because halacha l'maisa by chadash, I will say it says Kemach v'kali. Right. Ultimately, you remember, Rabbi say when it talked about what were the marketplaces of Yerushalayim filled with, they were filled with kemach, which means flour, and kali, which means parched grain. Neither of those are edible on their own. You have to process them further. Instead, Rabbi say the fact that they're preparing flour and parched grain, halacha l'maisa, again, those were not fit for consumption yet. So therefore, no one's going to consume it. So because no one's going to consume it, there's no concern about prohibited chadash consumption. To which the Gemara says, Had Rav Ashi bedusi. But the truth is, this statement of Rav Ashi is mistaken. Why? Hatenach meikali ve'elech meikara ad kali. Meikara kali ma'ikal. So we'll say, once you make it into kali, that's when it becomes inedible. But I will say, interestingly enough, apparently there's a period of production between the initial grinding and kali where it is edible. So we'll say, maybe you'll say, well, by chadash in general, we're not so concerned because, as we said before, you're harvesting it by hand. So once you're harvesting it by hand, that's enough of a shinui. So the Gemara says, but we also said that you could fully harvest this beis hashalchin, which was the irrigated field, the shema amakim, the field in the plains or in the valleys. Va'okimna krab Yehuda ma'ika l'meimar. Elad Rav Ashi bedusi. So we'll say again, you have to say that Rav Ashi's statement was incorrect. So we'll say, so therefore, again, to kind of forget about Rav Ashi, the Gemara says, very simple distinction. When it comes to Chadash, Rabbi Yehuda does not seem to be concerned because halacha l'maisa, people are aware of the Isser. It is a prolonged Isser. You have all of these other safety measures in place, and people generally stay away from Chadash. But when it comes to Chametz, people are the default is chametz consumption, right? The default is that it's permitted, and therefore, again, we are concerned that if we make you look for it at the time of Isser, you may come to inadvertently go ahead and consume it. The Rabbanan, no such concern. The whole reason you're looking for it is because halacha l'maisa you want to destroy it, and therefore we are not concerned that you will come to go ahead and eat it. So let's go back there. So we'll say, therefore, using that logic, it would appear that any situation that's not like chadash, right? Any situation that's not, meaning any situation where a person doesn't normally distance himself from the prohibited item, Rabbi Yehuda would be concerned and would not allow you to be involved with it. So the Gemara says, but is that true? So the Gemara says, Migaz Rabbi Yehuda. Now we learned, we'll say, B'amem Adlikin, Lo yikov Adam shvaver shabetza v'yimalena shemen v'yitnena b'tzad haner b'shilshet dehei min atefes. So let's listen to this. A person should not set up a contraption of a perforated eggshell in which they go ahead and put oil and put it right next to a lamp, a nair, in order for the oil to drip into the nair. I was about to say the halacha is that on Shabbos, if you're going to set up a lantern, a nair, right, then what we call a nair. Remember, I say a ner in Gemara. We had this in Sbichas Chav recently as well. Doesn't mean a candle. What does it mean? It means a receptacle, right? It's a receptacle in which you put oil and it has a little lip on the end of it for the wick. So I say the idea for Shabbos is when you set up a ner, all the oil necessary for the ner should be in the ner at the onset of Shabbos. You shouldn't have this contraption where you have a perforated eggshell that hangs over the ner, that's filled with oil, that drips oil into the nair over the course of Shabbos. We don't want you to know. And interestingly enough, well, all right, let's finish the case. The Gemara says, "Vafilu hishal cheres." Rabbi said, because what are we concerned? Let's go back. What are we concerned about? We're concerned that you may come to take some of the oil from the egg on Shabbos. Rabbi said, from the eggshell. And if you take the oil from the eggshell, then what are you doing? Essentially, that is a form of kibui. That is a form of extinguishing. Because what are you doing? You are removing ultimately, again, the fuel that is supposed to be designated for a fire on Shabbos. And this is true, the Gemara says, Vafilu hishal cheres. even if it's not an eggshell, but let's say you're using a piece of earthenware. Now the assumption is earthenware used for oil usually becomes disgusting, and you wouldn't normally go ahead and take oil out from that in order to use it from something else, for something else. But even in that kind of case, halacha l'maisa it'll be aser. B'yet v'Rabbi Yehuda matir. Rabbi Yehuda permits it. Now, if you look at Rashi says Rabbi Yehuda matir the afal gav the shemen hakol tedirin bo. Then I say everybody uses oil all of the time, and so I would have expected Rabbi Yehuda to say, of course, this is aser, because we're going to say this case should be more comparable to chametz than it is to what? Than it's to chadash. Right, because oil people use all of the time. I was saying even on Shabbos you could use oil. You want to put oil on your salad, you could use oil all of the time. I would have expected Rabbi Yehuda to say that halacha l'maisa, of course, there should be absolutely asir. Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's mutter, to which the Gemara says, also mishum chumra de Shabbos mavdil b'dilei. So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we're not concerned because halacha l'maisa, because of the chumra of Shabbos, because people treat the Isra of Shabbos with such severity. Ultimately, again, we're not concerned. So even if you put the oil in the eggshell, we're not concerned that a person is going to come to take the oil, because when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, people are aware of the Chumrah of Shabbos. V'rami the Shabbos are the Shabbos, but I can pose a contradiction to Rabbi Yehuda Shitas and Shabbos. So if we enter the first wide line, this sanya, chevel deletion ifsak, but say if you have a rope of a pail. Suppose say, imagine for a moment, you have a pail from which you draw water from a well. And there's a rope, obviously, that attaches that bucket, that pail to something. So the Gemara says, what happens? The rope breaks on Shabbos. Lo ye kosher ela onvo. You should not tie a knot. Rather, again, you should only bow. We'll say this is the end of, like we just had, it's the end of Maseches Eruvin. So you shouldn't tie a knot, because you're supposed to remember, again, tying a knot is the malach of kshira, right, of kosher, of tying. Rather, you should tie a bow. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, korich alav punda o psakya. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda says, what can you do? So we'll say you could go ahead and tie a belt around it. So essentially what you could do is, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't want you to knot it, doesn't even want you to bow it. What he says is you could take, let's say, a belt and wrap the belt around the two ripped parts of the rope and tie them together like that. But you can't go ahead and bow it. Kashed Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, what's going on over here? So again, interestingly enough, the Rabbanan allow you to bow it, and Rabbi Yehuda does not. So what's going on? Rabbanan lo kasha. So we'll say, interestingly enough, here's what's fascinating about this. So the Rabbanan, right, the same Rabbanan who won't allow you to set up this oil contraption on Shabbos, will allow you to go ahead and tie the two parts of the rope together in a bow. And yet Rabbi Yehuda, who will allow you to use the oil contraption on Shabbos, won't allow you to tie a bow with the two pieces of rope. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara said, Rabbanan kasha, shem b'shem michlaf. So we'll say, ultimately, again, the Rabbanan don't allow you to use the oil. Why? Because we'll say we are concerned, since people may inadvertently, since you could use oil in other permitted ways on Shabbos, we are concerned that halacha l'maisa, if we allow you to take oil from the egg, you may come to take oil from the ner itself. However, again, aniva b'kshir lo michlaf. But I will say we're not concerned that people are going to confuse tying a bow and tying a knot. Everyone knows that a bow is an impermanent form of tying. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, there's no concern that if we allow you to tie a bow, you'll come to tie a knot. Rabbi Yehuda kasha. Time Rabbi Yehuda la mishum de gazra aniva atu kshira. So we'll say Rabbi Yehuda is also not contradicting himself. Sorry, I'm supposed to remember, Rabbi Yehuda allows you to set up the whole oil contraption. Why does Rabbi Yehuda like to use the oil contraption? Because I will say, halacha l'maisa, again, we're not concerned that if we allow you to use this, you'll come to go ahead and take oil from the ner itself. Because again, in general, people understand the severity of Shabbos. So why doesn't he allow you to bow together the two pieces of torn rope? So the Gemara says, the kasavra aniva gufa kshiri. But say this is a different issue. Rabbi Yehuda holds that tying a bow is tantamount to tying a knot. It's the equivalent. Rabbi say he holds that tying a bow is the malacha of kshira. So we had this in Eruvin. Is the malacha of kashira itself. V'rami d'Rabbanan d'Rabbanan. So let's contrast the views of the Rabbanan. This nan koshin dili b'psakya. So we'll say ultimately again, you could go ahead and tie a dili. So we'll say this is a bucket, right? So if you have a bucket in general, right? So you have a bucket that you need to tie to the well. So you could go ahead and tie a well with a psakya. So we'll say, if you notice over here, if you take a look, so psak is just the strap. It says in the Hagos, strap. Avalo b'chevel, but you can't use a rope. For Rabbi Yehuda matir, If you look at Rashi, by the way, Rashi says over here, kosher di b'psakya, to love kersha so this kaim who de'eno mafse psakya shalo b'kach, avalo b'chevel shalo yenchenamos. We'll say, so the difference is, the psakya is like if you can imagine, maybe better illustrative is a belt. So you could tie, if you're on Shabbos, if you need to draw water, you could tie a belt to your bucket. Rabbi will say, why? Why? Because halacha l'maisa, you're gonna need the belt. So when you tie that belt to the bucket, that by definition is an impermanent knot, because you want your belt back. But you can't tie a rope to the bucket. Why not? What's the concern? Because if you tie a rope, then what? You can leave it there. And if you could leave it there, that is a kesher shakama, a real knot. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda matir bechevel. And Rabbi Huda even allows you to tie a rope. So the Gemara says, well, what's going on over here? So again, dimai, ilay mechevel da alma. If you say it's just stam a rope, for Rabbi Huda matir kesher shakayamahu. So the Gemara says, devadai asil batulei. We'll say, how could it be that Rabbi Huda would allow you to tie a regular rope to a bucket on Shabbos? And that ultimately, again, will be a true knot. In other words, tying a rope with a real knot, we'll say, to a bucket. Why would Rabbi Huda allow that? Ella pshita degardi. Rather, you have to say actually that the rope that Rabbi Huda allows is what we call a weaver's rope. So we'll say a weaver's rope by definition was a weaker rope, and therefore you can't really leave it on there long term. So by definition, this is an impermanent knot. V'gazur abanon chevel degardi atu chevel da'alma in chevel. So the Gemara says, and yet the Rabbanon where goes there that we are concerned about allowing you to use a weaver's rope, lest you come to go ahead and use a regular rope. Because chevel bechevel michlaf, because people could confuse different cases of ropes. However, aniva b'kshira no michlafa, but people don't confuse ultimately again cases of bows with knots. So therefore, we'll say the shita of the Rabbanon, interestingly enough, is you could tie a bow. Right? The Rabbanon always held tying a bow is never a problem of kshira, because by definition it is impermanent. The Rabbanon are a little bit more concerned with, however, what type of rope you attach to the bucket itself. So ultimately, again, they don't want you using any kind of rope, because even if we let you use a weaver's rope, which is a weaker rope and by definition impermanent, in the eyes of many people, a rope is a rope is a rope, and if we let you use a weaver's rope, you'll come to use a permanent rope and potentially tie it in a permanent way. Rabbi Yehuda, interestingly enough, holds that tying a bow is problematic. Tying a bow actually is a form of kshira, but where he's mekel is when the rope that you're using is by definition an impermanent one. That apparently, even if you attach that to the bucket with an actual knot, that is still called an impermanent solution, because halacha l'maisa, the rope itself is of an impermanent nature. Fine. So we'll say, so again, all we're trying to do over here is trying to figure out if the shita of Rabbi Yehuda by chametz carries through to his other shittas. So we'll say, remember again, the thing you have to keep in mind over here, this is Pesachim. So I want you to have a one-track mind, right? All chametz all the time. So we'll say, so again, what we're focusing on over here is the fundamental machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. Ultimately, again, what happens if you did not do bedika before the shas iser? You did not do bedika before chametz becomes aser. According to the Rabbanon, what do? Check. Bedika. You do bedika. Up until Pesach, so both say it's even into Pesach, but up until Pesach, according to Rabbi Yehuda, once the Zman Isser Chametz comes along, what do? Nothing. You don't check anymore. Why not? Rabbi Yehuda's stated shita is because we are concerned that if we command you to check for Chametz, you may what? Come to inadvertently eat it. The Rabbanon say that's ridiculous. If you're searching to go ahead and destroy it, you're not going to come to eat it. So we'll say, so therefore, the Gemara wants to try to understand, is Rabbi Yehuda espousing a principle or just a rule, right? We'll say if it's just a rule, then it's just by chametz. If it's a principle, then we should find it in other scenarios as well. So is Rabbi Yehuda saying, anytime you're not allowed to eat something, we don't want you handling it. So the Gemara goes right to both sides. So therefore, it appears that what we're saying is, in any situation where a person is cognizant of the severity and of the prohibition, and therefore stays away from the item, Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned about your handling it, as we've seen, by the way, so far now by Shabbos and by Chadash. So is that true? Vatanya, bechor she'ach sudam. But say if you have a bechor animal, remember again, the firstborn of your livestock normally goes to the Kohen. Your bechor has some type of blood disease. Then I both say, now remember again, how would they go ahead and remedy a blood disease? Right? Too much blood. The way they remedied a lot of things in the times of the Gemara, which was bloodletting. So we'll say the problem with bloodletting is you have to make an incision. The problem with making an incision is that you may cause a mum in the bechar. We'll say what happens if you have a mum in a bechar animal? then halacha l'maisa it's no longer kodesh, right? It could become the property ultimately again of the owner. So we'll say in general we don't want people making mumin in bachar animals. So watch this: bachar she'achsal dam afilu hu meis. Even if the animal is going to die because of its blood disorder, in makizin lo dam div Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says we don't let you draw blood from the animal. As we'll say, Rabbi Yehuda says you cannot go ahead and halacha l'maisa make a mum in the animal. Look at Rashi in makizin dam afilu makom she'ino osa bo mum. Dainu b'chol makom shabo im incha chotek mimeno etzem o pogim svaso o ozno v'chol davar chozer lekamuso havi mum. Idach lahavimum. Because Rabbi Yehuda atu makom she'osebamum va'af agav dekachud. So listen to this, Rabbi say. So there's plenty of ways to bloodlet, right? In ways that will not cause permanent injury, ultimately again to the animal itself, right? Plenty of ways to go ahead and deal with that. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara says over here is as follows. So halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't want you bloodletting the animal, even in a situation where halacha l'maisa, there's not going to be a mum. We just don't want you doing it out of a concern that you may come to make a mum. Now, Rabbi say, Kachim is a wonderful example of an area where people are very careful. Very careful. Yet Rabbi Yehuda does not even want you bloodletting on the animal. So the Gemara says, no, you could do bloodletting, as long as you don't go and do a mum. So we'll say, here's an example that seems to contradict the principle. Here's a case of an item or an area of halacha where people are very vigilant and very cognizant. And yet Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't even want you doing permissible bloodletting, lest you come to do something that is prohibited. To which the Gemara says, Hasam mitoch adam bo al mamono amud beis aminan isharis le b'makom she'in osin bomum asilemi abid b'makom she'osin bomum. To which the Gemara says something quite fascinating. So this is different, Rabbi Say. Because a person sometimes becomes overwhelmed when dealing with their money, we're concerned that a person may come to make a mistake. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough over here, so right, the Kohen does not want, or the Yisrael doesn't want the Bechar animal to die. So because, again, we're concerned the animal might die, people end up doing things, they don't think straight when there is a significant loss on the line. That's what Rabbi Yehuda is concerned about. So the Gemara says, Asi leme avid b'makom she'osin b'mum, v'rabbanan kol shekein di'ilo sharis le'klal asi leme avid. And the Rabbanan will say all the more so, that's the reason to permit a person to do bloodletting on the Bechar animal. Why? Because if you prohibit it, I will say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? The Rabbanan say, people will do it anyway. Why will people do it anyway? Because most people can't just stand by and witness a significant financial loss. That's just the derech of most people. They're not able to do. So therefore, I will say, this particular case, ultimately, again, doesn't pose a kasha to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda just says, even though kachim is generally something that people are very careful with, and when people are careful with something, we're okay with them handling that item. This is different. Because there is the possibility of a significant loss, people don't think straight in situations of significant loss. Therefore, we don't want you doing bloodletting, even in a way that won't cause a mum, lest you come to inadvertently cause a mum because you're so overwhelmed by the possibility of the loss. Is this true that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we say that people become overwhelmed with the prospect of significant financial loss and therefore end up making mistakes? So what this is very interesting. You cannot makadrin. Now, Rashi quotes some French word, right? But if you look at the bays and Agos v'tziyunim, he says listrok saras pehima imasrek barzel. So, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, you are not permitted to comb the wool or the fur of an animal or the mane of an animal on Yom Tov. Now, this is with an iron comb. With an iron comb. Now, the reason you can't go ahead and comb with an iron comb is ultimately, again, because such a comb would often cause bleeding in the animal. So you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, Meshu ose chabura, Yom Tov, because you make a chabura, aval mekartzefin. Rabbi say, but you could do mekartzefin. What's mekartzefin? So Rabbi say, this was a, Rashi says, or mekartzefin, kidarashinon, bekli sheshin of gasos, ve'ino ose chabura. So Rabbi say, so apparently, the metal comb had much finer teeth. This other comb, which Rashi points out was a wooden comb, had much larger teeth on the comb, and therefore Allah said this was there really to get out dirt, and therefore you could do so without going ahead and causing any chabura to the animal. The Chum say ein mekadrin af ein mekartzefin. The Chum say you can't do either. You can't do either. V'tanya ezu kidar ve'ezu kirtzuf. And we'll say ultimately again, the Braisa says, what's kidar, what's kirtzuf? Kidar kitanim vosin chabura. So kidar means using a very fine tooth comb that was made of metal, and ultimately again, you could cause the animal an injury. Kirtzuf kidol ve'inos in chabura. Kirtzuf on the other hand, was using a large tooth comb, and you don't make a chaburi, you don't make any kind of injury. So hasam di shavikli mayis. Armina Adam Bala Mamono. We'll say it's in the case of, so we'll say, what the Gemara is just pointing out over here is that halacha lemaisa, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can go ahead and do mekartzefin, right? You could use the big tooth comb, and we're not concerned that you're going to come to inadvertently what? Use the fine tooth comb. Even though, again, we'll say you're dealing with an animal which could be worth money. So yet we see Rabbi Yehuda holds that even in a situation of money, people could think rationally, to which the Gemara says the comparison is not right. So the Gemara says, Hasam, di ishavikli mayis. We'll say, in the case of the Bechar, that has some type of blood issue, if you don't treat the animal will die. However, the Gemara says, Aminan Adam Bal Amamono. That's when we say that a person is overwhelmed regarding their money, and a person may come to make mistakes. Hacha ishavik leitzara ba'amo lo aminan Adam Bal Amamono. Ultimately, we'll say, in this case here by the comb, we'll say, what's the worst case scenario if you don't comb out the mane of the animal? What's the worst case scenario? It has some discomfort. It's not going to die. So in that kind of case, I will say, where there's no possibility of death of the animal and major loss, we assume a person could think straight. Rabbi Yehuda is concerned in a case where there's the real possibility of loss. If you don't do bloodletting on the Bechar, that's ultimately when the animal could die. In that case, Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what, don't do anything, because I'm concerned in a situation like that, you will come to make a mistake. Rabbi Yehuda, Maishna Gabe Chametz, the Gazer, or Maishna Gabe Kirtzov to Lo Gazer. But say, listen to this. So we'll say, so here's what we have. So Rabbi Yehuda allows you to do kirtzuf on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda says that halacha l'maisa. I'm saying not kirtzuf. Sorry. I say kirtzuf. So I'll say, why is Rabbi Yehuda allows you to comb the animal with a large tooth comb, and we're not concerned that what? We're not concerned that you may come to use the fine tooth comb and cause an injury to the animal. Yet, by chametz, after the Zman Isser, we don't allow you to search for chametz. We are concerned that if you come to handle the chametz, so we'll say, you see what's happening over here? We allow you to handle the animal on Yom Tiv, and we allow you to handle it in a way that is permitted, and we are not concerned that by allowing you to handle the animal, you'll handle it in a way that is prohibited. Yet by chametz, we are concerned that if we allow you to handle it, then what? You'll come to eat it. To which the Gemara is very simple. The Gemara says, Lechem belechem michlaf, kidar bekirtzaf lo michlaf. Because they both say, people could get confused with bread, right? Lechem and lechem michlaf. You're used to eating bread all of the time. It's easy to understand why you might make a mistake after the Zman Isser. But by combs, people understand that only certain combs will be permitted, but other combs ultimately, again, will be prohibited. So therefore, I will say, the way the sugya closes out is that halacha l'maaseh we are left with a yisodistic machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. Namely, again, do we check for chametz after the Zman Isser? Rabbi Yehuda says no, out of a concern that halacha l'maaseh, again, you may come to eat it. This yields, or this births, a dramatic sheet about Rabbi Yehuda, that in general, we don't want you handling things that are prohibited, lest you come to consume it / use it. Are there exceptions to Rabbi Yehuda's rule? Absolutely. Chadash is a good exception. The oil in the eggshell is a good exception. But ultimately, again, it appears combing out an animal with a large tooth. Comb is an exception. There are exceptions. Where the Isser is severe enough that we are confident that a person on their own will stay from the Isser, Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned. But by chametz, which a person is used to consuming all year long, we are concerned. We'll say, and the Rabbanan will say, no, we're not concerned you're going to eat it when the entire purpose you're searching is why? To destroy it. So how are we passing the machlokes? We'll see. Let's just get on the Mishnah before we have to stop. Mishnah, Rabbi Meir Omer, Ochlin kol chametz shesarfen mitchila shesh. We'll say dramatic Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says, you could eat chametz the entire fifth hour, and you begin to burn chametz the beginning of the 6th hour. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no. Ochlin kol arba, you eat through the 4th hour. Tolin chol chametz, we'll say suspended. You suspend the chametz during the 5th hour, which means you don't eat it, but you could get benefits from it, but you don't eat it. And then you burn chametz the 6th hour. Va'odam Rabbi Yehuda, not only that, Rabbi Yehuda said, Shtei chalos. Shal toda psulas munachas agabi itztava. Both say there were two chalos from a carbon toda. Remember again, a carbon toda was brought with many loaves. They had 2 invalid loaves from the carbon toda that they used to put on the itztaba. We'll discuss what this is. This was a row of benches by the harabayis. Kolzman shemunachas, and Rabbi said those two loaves were there as a sign to the general public. As long as the loaves were there, kala om ochlin. Everybody could eat chametz. Nitla achas, when one loaf was removed, tolin lo ochlin velo sarfin. Then Rabbi said you can get hana, but you can't eat chametz. You don't have to burn it yet. Nitlu shtehem. As soon as both loaves were removed, that was a sign it's time to go ahead and begin burning your chametz. So we'll say that was like the public service reminder. Those two loaves are the public service reminder. Rabbi Gamliel says chulin could be consumed through 4 hours, through the 4th hour. Truma kol chamesh. Truma could be eaten for an additional hour through the 5th hour. And we begin to burn chametz ultimately again, beginning of the 6th hour. So therefore, we'll say 3-way machlokes. We have Rabbi Meir saying that halacha l'maisa, you could eat chametz through the 5th hour, begin to burn at the 6th hour. We have Rabbi Huda saying you eat through the 4th, tolin the 5th, burn the 6th. And Rabbi Gamliel saying, interesting distinction between chulin and truma. You could eat chulin through the 4th hour, truma through the 5th hour, burn the 6th hour. We'll continue Mir Hashem tomorrow. Shkach Habosai.